Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a list of 10 works by major composers that they never should have revised. I mean, we may understand why they did it or what they were aiming at, but the originals were so splendid and glorious and wonderful, you wish they just would have left the damn thing alone. Now, it's axiomatic that when a genius composer revises a work, the revisions are usually better. I mean, demonstrably better. That's the case 9 times out of 10. But there are those cases where the composer was either of two minds or external circumstances forced them to take certain actions where the result is just not as good. And often the result is the one that we're used to, the one that's come down to us. And so I think it'd be fun to just take a look at 10 pieces where composers were forced to make revisions or decided to make revisions of their own accord, where they just should have left it alone. Oh my goodness. And I'm sure you may have some of your own suggestions for works that belong on the list. I can think of a lot more than 10. And I left out some goodies so that you would have a chance to chime in with them. So let's begin, shall we? Let's start with, here's a rarity. Hindemith's opera Cardillac. Now, Cardillac was the masterpiece of his early period, his early youthful, expressionistic combination, sort of neoclassical period. I know neoclassical expressionism is kind of odd, but that's what Cardillac is. It's a wonderful story. It's based on an E.T.A. Hoffmann story, the Die Fräulein von Scudieri, about a goldsmith who writes pieces of who writes. He doesn't write. He's a goldsmith. He makes pieces of jewelry that he is so in love with for their beauty and perfection that whenever someone buys one, he murders them and steals it back. And the original version of this opera, which is from the 1920s, is an unabashed assertion of the right of the artist to control his products, the products of his imagination and creativity. And it's an indictment of the shallowness and cheapness of society, which regards art as a mere commodity. It's a wonderfully provocative piece written in a harsh, biting idiom, and it's just brilliant. It's brilliant. It's never going to be popular. I mean, not too many people like it, but oh my goodness, it's a great story and it's a fabulous setting. And Hindemith, later in life, became a socially conscious composer, which a lot of people would think is a good thing. He decided that composers had an obligation to effect some sort of a rapprochement with their audiences and write things that were more comprehensible and easier to tolerate. And so he revised the work to add a character, to make Cardillac, who was just a murderer, somehow more sympathetic, to explain his actions in a more acceptable way. Oh, it's just a mess. Nobody cares about it, actually. And happily, everybody plays the original version. And with good reason, because that's the fun one. That's the one we all should be hearing. So that's work number 1. Number 2, a similar but slightly different case, but similar in many respects, Shostakovich's opera Lady Macbeth of Mtensk district. Now, for many of us, the only way you could hear it was in its later version, originally, which was, what's her name? Lady Macbeth, who was, Katerina Ismailova. That was her name. Oh, that thing you saw there, that's Finster. Here's Finster, by the way. There you go. Hello, Finster. How you doing, kiddo? I know, you like to play and chomp and bite and whatnot. She's relaxing there, and I'm going to get Mildred in there too. You wait and see. Mildred is right down there, but she is camera shy, but I'll get her in there eventually. Anyway, Katerina Ismailova. Yeah, well, Lady Macbeth of Mtensk was like Cardillac. I mean, it was a character that was so unsympathetic in an opera that was so nasty in all of it. I mean, it made fun of everybody, especially the police, especially the state. They were a bunch of bumbling fools. And, Shostakovich got in horrible trouble, of course, as we all know, with that opera. Hindemith revised his opera out of inner necessity and compulsion. and his change in philosophical aesthetics. Shostakovich did it because he was going to get killed and because they would never perform it unless he made changes. And because he was forced to do that, that's how the opera was originally released on Melodia. And it wasn't until Rostropovich and Vishnevskaya made their recording of the original version in the West that we got to hear the piece in all of its raw, nasty intensity. Oh, God, what a masterpiece it is. But we never would have known. I think there's a general agreement there that the later version was done out of more duress than desire, and so we ignore it. And that's a good thing, because the original's fabulous. Next, Prokofiev, Symphony No. 4. Now, this symphony exists in two versions. The original version is for a smallish orchestra. It's based on Prokofiev's ballet music, and wonderful ballet music it is. And the second version is bigger and longer and more heavily scored and thick and socialist realist and all that. And you can choose which one you like. Some people prefer the second version. I prefer the original version for its lightness and unashamed danceability. I know it's supposed to be a symphony. It's supposed to be heavy. It's supposed to be important. That's why Prokofiev, revised it. But I think that the original version has it all in over the longer revised version. But I've heard arguments on both sides, and I understand that that's a possibility. So I mean, I'm not going to make a definitive judgment on that one. Next, number 4, Bernstein's Kaddish Symphony. Now, the Kaddish Symphony is terribly problematic, as some of you may know. It has this narrator who's having an argument with God. Oh, hi. Come say hello. There you go. Who's having an argument with God over, various and sundry things. And in between that, the orchestra and the chorus and the soloists are doing, their ritual business. Now, Bernstein later took out some of the narration. He said it was too talky. And it was. It truly was. And also he made a couple revisions to the text and the orchestration at the very end, none of which made any difference. The real problem with the taking out some of the stuff from the original is that nothing is going to make a piece for narrator and orchestra any more palatable if you cannot stand pieces for narrator and orchestra. It makes no difference whatsoever. I personally think pieces for narrator and orchestra are loathsome. But I like the Kaddish Symphony, actually. I just get past the narrator. And once you've gotten past the narrator, you're past it. So you might as well have the whole thing in all of its original sort of outrageousness and take it that way as it comes. In making a revision, Bernstein kind of admitted that he was wrong in the first place, but there was no way to fix the thing structurally. It is what it is. So I'd rather hear what it is rather than what it is trying to be but isn't quite getting there. Know what I mean? So there you go. There you go. Bernstein's Kaddish Symphony number 5. Oh yeah, Beethoven's String Quartet number 13 in B flat. You know that one. That's the one whose original finale was the Grosse Fuge. Now the Grosse Fuge is insane. It's one of the ugliest pieces ever written, as I've pointed out before, and some of you can jump up and down and carry on. It's definitely ugly. It's deliberately ugly. It's about struggle. It's an unpleasant struggle that finally resolves in the end, and we're all happy. But getting there is a chore. It is. It's an ordeal, and that ordeal should have been preserved. But of course, Beethoven wanted the piece to get played, the quartet, every so often, and so he cut out the Grosse Fuge and made it a separate thing and added a new finale. Now, that new finale is perfect as it stands. It goes wonderfully with the rest of the quartet. It sums it up nicely, but it ain't no Grosse Fuge. And most quartets, I would say today, restore the original version when they can. And it makes sense. It makes the piece horrendously long and much more difficult to listen to, but who cares? We are modern people. We can take our medicine. We can stand it. We've heard much worse than the Grosse Fuge, although Stravinsky said famously that it was, a totally contemporary piece of music that will be contemporary forever. And he was right. It sounds contemporary forever. It's an obdurate, difficult piece. And so what? Suck it up, people. Just deal with it. Anyway, that's, I think, one of the more entertaining of these cases, frankly. Next, let's see, a couple more operas we have. Yes, we have to. Wagner, The Flying Dutchman. Now, The Flying Dutchman in its original version is absolutely marvelous. And you can hear that original version in Otto Klemperer's recording, which is the reference recording for The Flying Dutchman, instead of the 3-act revision. You know, he broke it up, and then he added the transfiguration finale, you know, where the spirits of Senta and the Fliegender Hollander are like wafting off into heaven. Ugh. Yeah. First of all, Wagner, you know, was one of those composers who very slowly matured into his, late idiom. It took him time to get there. He had a lot of indecision along the way. The Flying Dutchman is a surpassingly uninteresting opera, and stretching it out and breaking it up doesn't help it. You're better off getting it over with as quickly as possible. The best thing about it, as Tovey said, is the overture. The overture is marvelous. There's nothing in the opera that approaches the overture in terms of quality. So you might as well play the thing in a single outpouring rush of activity and action, and have the ending be the actual ending. Only one ending, and make people sit there through the whole thing. I find when you listen to it in one act that it all coheres so much better, obviously, because it's in one act, but not just that, but because the events succeed each other in a way that doesn't give you time to question why you've bothered to come in the first place. You know what I mean? So The Flying Dutchman, I think, works far better when we stick with Wagner's original conception. And the differences are not so huge that they would justify, presenting it in clumps. You get one big clump is better than 3 smaller, less attractive clumps. So after that, let's see, Verdi's Don Carlo. Now, grand operas are always problems, right? They're always problematic because they're big and huge and expensive, and you have to make, they're always subject to the whims of the producers or the singers, and composers are always making changes, and it is always a mess. And finding a definitive version of any of these things is virtually impossible. But Don Carlo, in its original 5-act version, is dramatically and structurally superior than Verdi's final 4-act revision for one very simple reason. The 4-act version gives Don Carlo virtually nothing to do. I mean, he barely appears in Don Carlo. It's about everybody else. It's a big sprawling piece anyway, based on one of those Schiller historical dramas. And it's immensely gripping. I mean, the most powerful scene in the whole opera, aside from the auto da fe, the big crowd scene where they're like burning people at the stake, is the scene between Philip and the Grand Inquisitor. They're two, a baritone and a bass, and it's just chilling, fabulously marvelous. And it has nothing to do with Don Carlo. I mean, it does tangentially, but, in terms of who's participating, Don Carlo gets one aria, and in the 4-act version, he sings it right at the beginning, and then he sort of wanders through the rest of the opera while everyone else is doing their machinations. And it's better to have 5 acts where you can let the characters develop in a more leisurely but more effective way, and stick Don Carlo's aria in a more effective place, and it really works better when you've got 5 acts to work with. Now, I don't care so much whether you do it in French or not. I mean, that's not really important. Originally, it was written in French for Paris. It sounds perfectly fine in French, and if you do it in Italian translation, you're in good shape as well. And you may want to take in some other variants, such as the 4-act finale, which is really very good because it has a tam-tam in it, and anything that has a tam-tam has got to be better inherently. But generally speaking, if you're going to go with Don Carlo, the recorded history has shown that 5 acts are better than 4. So after Don Carlo, well, here's one that you may not encounter or think about too often, but it actually did get changed fairly considerably. Walton's Belshazzar's Feast. Now, I adore Belshazzar's Feast, and Walton was an extremely extremely self-critical composer who was always making revisions and tinkering with things, and composed very slowly anyway to bang everything into shape. Belshazzar's Feast is, of course, a big, hairy, youthful piece of orchestral and choral mayhem, with extra brass in the balconies. It's like 9 trumpets and whatnot. Beecham told Walton, use all the brass you want because it's only ever going to get performed once. Well, he was wrong. It gets performed more than once, but Walton went through the thing very carefully prior to final publication and weeded out some of the percussion. Why did he do that? And thinned out the orchestration a little bit. No, it's much better in its good old, original, overscored, splashy, slightly vulgar, over-the-top original. It really is. I mean, I want those extra cymbal crashes in there. In fact, even in the notes to the critical edition, which I have the score right over there, they say, it's a pity Walton revised this because it just sounded more effective and more impactful the way he originally wrote it. And you may not notice the differences. They're not huge. But I do miss like a cymbal crash here, a thing there. You hear just some oddities of balance and stuff that you didn't hear in the original versions of it. And I wish that he hadn't bothered. It wasn't necessary. He really should have just left well enough alone. But the last two, I had to do too, because it concerns the ultimate revising composer whose maladroit revisions have dogged him ever since. And of course, it's Bruckner. I mean, these revisions determine the difference between Bruckner and Bruckner. Yeah, you know what I mean, right? And 2 symphonies come immediately to mind. I mean, Bruckner revised things partly because he wanted to, partly because he had to, partly because people pushed him to. And untangling his motivations is really almost impossible. But what we can do is go with the judgment of our enlightened hearing, in which some revisions, such as that of the 8th Symphony, are absolutely fabulous and totally necessary, and others were completely unnecessary and mistaken. The 2 biggest mistaken revisions were those of the 3rd Symphony, its last version. There are 3 versions of the 3rd Symphony, or maybe more than that, but basically there was the original, which is excessively long and formally diffuse, but lots of fun, with the Wagner quotations in it and whatnot. It's fun. The middle version, which is the one you should go with, and which was the one Bruckner actually bequeathed to the library and whatever, it was the one that Bruckner kind of liked the best. And then there was the last version that was somewhat pushed on him by the Schock brothers, or one of those people, where the finale is completely mangled because it's missing its recapitulation and it's become way too short, and formally it's shorter. The music is still wonderful because its basic material is wonderful, but the overall shape of it is like, it's like cutting your arm off, and it's like adding a hump. It's not a happy final revision, and that's the one we hear most often, Bruckner's last version. It really ought to be the middle version that we hear because it gives you more music and it's more effectively laid out. No question about it. Period, exclamation point. I will admit of no contrary views on this thread. So don't go there. Next and last but not least, it's Bruckner's First Symphony, which exists in 2 basic versions, although the Bruckner people have come up with another one, of course. Why not? Who cares? The first version, what we call the Linz version, which was not actually the first version. There's a pre-Linz version. Never mind. The Linz version is marvelous as it stands, but it's it's pure Bruckner. It's a very interesting and different work from what most people would have been used to in a symphony of the day. It's cool. And it has a really clear shape and outline, and everything it's nicely done. It really is. The revised Vienna version, everybody hates. Everyone said to Bruckner, no, stop. It's fine the way it is. And it was total agreement of everybody except Bruckner. But Bruckner had one of his fits of nerves and insecurity and decided he had to revise everything before finishing the 9th, which was a big mistake because as a result, he didn't finish the 9th. Of course, from what there is of the 9th, maybe it was better that it stayed unfinished. But the point is, he softened the edges of the original Linz version and added all kinds of, useless orchestral filigree and detail. Again, the differences are not enormous. I mean, you have to know the work well to know what the differences are. But once you know the Linz version really well, listening to the Vienna version is not easy. And most people, in comparison, and most people, most conductors, that is, prefer the original Linz version. One of the great exceptions was Günter Wand, who stood by Bruckner's final thoughts, but most prefer version number 1, and I am one of those. Absolutely. Here, however, I will admit there can be 2 contrary views because both are vintage Bruckner. And he himself preferred, of course, his last revision. But you have to remember with composers always prefer their last versions. That's why they made them. So their opinion actually isn't definitive in the sense that most of them don't have the opportunity to hear their work in performance frequently enough to develop an unbiased view of the situation. I remember I had a very interesting conversation with the late, great Finnish composer Eino Juhani Rautavaara, who was just a wonderful guy. And I asked him, do you really know, just writing a piece of music, what it's going to sound like? And, how do you approach it? I was really curious about this. And he's a very honest and open guy. And he said, we hope we know what it's going to sound like. We think we know what it's going to sound like. He said, but the reality is, I'm not going to have many opportunities to hear it, to hear my own work, especially if it's a big orchestral work. You have to get a conductor who's willing to play it. They have to perform it with some regularity. You have to be available to listen to it. He said, I hear the premiere. Maybe I'll hear a couple broadcasts. The other performances I'm not going to have anything to do with, and I'm not going to be available to attend. So, you write a piece and you hear it at the premiere. You hope it's a good performance, and then you revise it. you look at what you did wrong. You revise it, and then you have to hope, he said, that your publisher is willing to reprint it, because your publisher just spent a fortune printing the parts and everything. And then you say, no, it's all wrong. Here, do it this way. And that's really a problem. It's really a fascinating question. It's the technicalities of it, the logistics of it. And so, that's what he said. And we had, Rautavaara and I, a very similar and interesting conversation about his 8th symphony, because I was at the premiere with the Philadelphia Orchestra under Sawallisch, and I didn't really care for the slow movement very much. I thought it was too short and that the proportions weren't right. And I told him that. And he smiled. He said, wait until you hear a better performance. And then the recording came out on Ondine with Leif Segerstam and the Helsinki Philharmonic, and it all made sense. And I wrote to him and said, you were right. I said, you were absolutely right. Yeah, it sounds much better. He said, see? He said, I'm happy that what I thought about, actually did work in the long run. There are ways to make it go. So, the lesson in all of this, I think, if we take home a lesson, is that works of art are fluid things, especially works that move through time, through the medium of sound. You hope you have a picture of it in your head. You hope that you've realized on the printed page what your conception was. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And the reasons for making changes, they're all over the place. They can be to correct mistakes, but they could also be for personal reasons we know nothing about, or external pressure, or whatever, or a final realization of what the shape of the thing is supposed to be. It's a very, very, very tricky situation. But I maintain that the evidence of the great composers, Mahler and Sibelius and people like that, especially in orchestral music, show that revisions are almost always better than the originals. But there are some cases where they aren't. And if you've got a few, feel free to chime in and let me know what they are. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.